welcome everyone to today's webinar brought to you by the HybridNeuro project. Today we have a fantastic presentation lined up about regulatory strategy in the UK and Europe, and I'm very excited to introduce our speaker in a moment. But first I'll just explain a little bit about what HybridNeuro is, what the project is, what we do. So let me share my screen. So the HybridNeuro project has been running for about 2.5 years. We're funded by the European Union and the UK Research and Innovation Fund. We're a consortium of 4 universities in Europe and the UK. First is Imperial College London in the UK, where I am, the Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden, the Universitat Politècnica de Catalunya in Barcelona in Spain, and our coordinator university, the University of Maribor in Slovenia. So in addition to academic exploratory research in the area of neurophysiology and human control of movement, we deliver opportunities for knowledge and skills sharing. For example, we organize workshops and summer schools and hands-on training events. So this is our website that you can see right now. So I would encourage you to have a look here. You can catch up with all of the very interesting initiatives we've been involved in, as well as keeping up to date with our next events. So in addition to the in-person events that we have organized, we also organize webinars. So today will be our 7th webinar in our series. We started with webinars around research and planning skills, soft skills, and now we have turned our focus to hands-on training. Sorry, not hands-on training, to technology transfer skills. So I encourage you to go through our back catalogue. We have a YouTube channel, HybridNeuro, where we have uploaded a lot of our previous presentations. Our webinar series, for example, looks like this. We've had webinars in data management and ethics, promoting gender equality in science, intellectual property, and there's still a few more webinars still to be uploaded. So I encourage you to have a look at this. In addition to our webinars, we've got over 40 hours of content from our previous events, our summer school presentations, our workshop presentations. So there's a very valuable resource, and I encourage you to check it out. So that brings us on to our next event, which is our webinar, which we're very excited about. Ivan Inover spoke at our summer school last Friday, and she has very kindly agreed to return to give a similar but maybe expanded view on regulation processes in the UK, the EU, and the US. Her presentation is called Translating Innovation into Regulatory Success. Ivan is both the founder and CEO of PharmXL. Her company is a leading UK-based clinical research organisation known for its high-quality, patient-focused approach to clinical trial management. PharmXL acts as a bridge between research and real-world applications. It supports academic institutions, NHS trusts, research charities, companies in navigating this complex landscape of clinical trials. So Ivan's expertise lies in regulatory and operational excellence, but also in driving innovation and collaboration in order to bring research very like ours, to life. So thank you very much for joining us again, Ivan. It's a real pleasure to have you back after such a successful day last week. So I will stop sharing my screen and invite you to share yours. We're very much looking forward to your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that, Kieran, before I
can
start?
Yep, I can see you and hear you.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. So as Kieran said, I delivered this presentation last Friday to a fantastic group, actually, at Imperial. Really mixed bunch, I think, that we had there. Some really quite early on in their journey, others much further forward in their journey. We held a really interactive panel session with Daniel Green and 2 other startups, and we had lots and lots of really engaging, interactive conversations around what this journey was going to look like. And part of those questions, well, some of those questions that came up were really around, when do we start engaging with regulators? At what point do we start having to think about how those regulatory sort of pathways and frameworks really apply? And so we had lots of sort of interesting debates around those areas. So part of this webinar really is to take you through some of that process, to look at how you start to engage with regulators, some of the key points that you really need to start thinking about, how early on really you need to start thinking about those elements. So if we sort of move ourselves forward as well and thinking about the framework, I suppose, in which we want to think about that translation, clearly I wanted to choose a framework that was probably close to many of your hearts, and I obviously think that the brain and its functions is a really great analogy to be able to look at that framework and the similarities between some of the elements that you're going to find yourself sort of interacting or going through along your conformity and regulatory journey. I'm clearly going to pack in what is probably a whole day's worth of regulations into a 40-minute presentation. So it's a little bit fast paced. There are a few busy slides on here, but hopefully you'll have a recording of this at the end that you can refer to. Again, I want to thank Kieran and the HybridNeuro team for inviting me to come and speak with you today. It's a real pleasure to be involved, in all the elements that you guys have been sort of progressing with. So thank you very much for that. So I suppose the key thing I need to point out at this point, and it's a sad story, but it's genuinely a reality, is that not all device manufacturer startups make it. It's a really tough journey to go on. It's certainly not a journey that one can experience in isolation. You're going to absolutely need to surround yourself with a very dedicated, highly skilled set of professionals to help support you on your journey. And I would certainly say that key is the preparation, really, in many, many respects. You almost have to sort of start at the end before you can really start at the beginning. So really thinking about what your end goal is going to look like during that period of time, because that's really going to dictate your regulatory pathway and some of the elements that you need to start thinking about. So key is absolute preparation, really, in translating your wonderful innovations through into that regulatory sort of successful arena. So you absolutely need to start thinking about your device. What does your device do? What do you intend your device to do? How do you want your device to perform? Where do you want to sell your device? All of those things really they sound relatively simple questions, but actually it's going to build up a framework and a picture as to what your commercialization and your conformity route looks like. So really thinking about the intended purpose of your device is absolutely crucial. Thinking about your target market, the whole reason why you're creating this new device, this new innovation, is because clearly you have established that there is an unmet need somewhere. There are patients that clearly need your device. So that could be, we heard actually on Friday from some amazing innovators and startups looking at stroke rehabilitation and the devices that they were trying to sort of bring to the market and commercialize. And they'd really thought about what that's going to mean to the end users, both in terms of patients, but also those that are going to be interacting with the device. So thinking about what your target audience looks like, thinking about what your target market looks like. So planning that out right at the very beginning. Once you've worked out what you're intending to do with your device and how your device is then going to be commercialized and sold. It's really then mapping out that early stage regulatory process. So starting at the end actually gives you the sort of component parts that you can then start to map out your regulatory stages and when your interactions are going to be relevant with the authorities. You really need to think about how the regulations are going to apply to you. So each manufacturer, each device, there are different sets of regulations that actually apply in those areas. So you as a new startup are going to think about, do I want to just work in the UK, in which case the UK regulations are going to apply to me. Do I want to work in the European Union, in which case the European regulations are going to apply to me? Or do I want to go further afield to the US or Australia or wherever? Those sets of regulations are going to apply to me. But once you start to think about different territories, once you start to think about different markets, it's then what are the nuances and the differences around those regulations. So as I said before, starting at the end really allows you to then start working effectively at the very beginning. Here in the UK, obviously, your ultimate aim is to commercialise your medical device and obtain your UK CA mark. If you're wanting to go to Europe and sell your product in the European Union, then obviously you're going to be applying for a European CE mark. The US is definitely a little bit more complicated because it depends on what you want to do with your device, what the risk factors are involved in your device, what the classifications are, and then that will dictate the routes that you're going to take. So whether that's a 510K clearance route, whether that's looking at pre-market authorization, whether that's looking at sort of de novo, really innovative, brand new medical devices. So it's really thinking about those elements. So as I said, I think the brain and the sort of neurological framework is quite a good analogy to be able to compare the routes that you're going to take. So for those of you in the audience that are sort of budding neurologists or neurophysicists, I'm sure you're all aware that this is our frontal cortex here. So this is your decision-making center. So if you compare that to what you're going to be going through and the startup that you're going to be making, this is really where you define your regulatory direction. So it's coming together to think about what that pathway actually looks like. So as we said before, if you're looking to launch your medical device in the UK, Europe or the US market, you have to ensure that all of the relevant regulations you are familiar with, you understand how they apply to you. So here in the UK, we have a medical device regulation that's specific to the UK market. In Europe, you'll have a medical device regulation, again, that's specific to the European market. And in the US, you will be dealing with the Code of Federal Regulations, which have lots of parts that are related to medical devices and how you apply them. It means that all the documentation that you are going to collate as part of this journey has to conform with the relevant set of regulations. So for instance, your quality management system, there are different requirements under the regulations for you to comply with. Thinking about your risk management processes, what that's going to look like under the regulations, and then also dictating what your conformity assessment route is going to look like in your particular market. So having a real thorough understanding of those regulations and how they apply to you really allows you to map out and define your regulatory direction. So I can't emphasize enough, you absolutely need to decide very early on the direction in which you want to take. There are benefits clearly for working in multiple territories. You can obviously widen the sort of population pool. If you look at the UK and Europe alone, you're talking about millions of people that you could potentially sell your product to. And then you've got the US on top of that. But the more markets and the more territories you start to look at, clearly, the more complex your journey is going to be, both in terms of conformity assessment and also in terms of commercialization. The journey doesn't just stop once you've managed to get your product onto the market. Really, that's just the beginning in many, many respects. Because then you've got to start thinking about all your post-marketing surveillance, your safety management, the data that you're going to gather, at that end of your journey. So again, it's continuously keeping on top of what the regulations are saying and how you're managing all of your technical documentation to support that. So this slide, again, is a busy slide, but really where I want to draw your attention to the areas highlighted in red. So it's just to outline to you the different sets of regulations that are going to apply in the different territories that you may find yourself working in. So here in the UK, we have the Medical Device Regulation 2002. One of the key differences that you need to be aware of is that our set of regulations also includes in vitro diagnostics. So it doesn't just include general medical devices. Whereas if you're looking at the European Medical Device Regulation, so that's 2017-745, that is purely related to general medical devices. There is a separate set of regulations if you're going to be working in the field of in vitro diagnostics. And obviously in the US, you're going to be dealing with the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. So you're looking at the Code of Federal Regulations. And there's parts under those codes that then are absolutely pertaining to general medical devices. And there are also other regulations that pertain to in vitro diagnostics. Here in the UK and in Europe, we separate out our Class 2s. So we have Class 2A and Class 2B. And really, there are nuanced differences, and it's really around the risk of the device itself. Obviously, in the US, they only have Class 1, 2, and 3. So it's just being aware that there's just those subtle differences. Again, when you're thinking about your quality management system that you will have to have in place, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, you will be dealing with harmonized international standards, which is the ISO standards. So the standard pertaining to quality management systems are 13485 standards. In the US, it's a little bit different. They are looking to try and align much more with the ISO standards. I think that's going to come out around about February 26. So they're definitely moving towards that way. But at the moment, it's 21 CFR Part 820 that's surrounding quality management systems. So you can see in each of these territories that there are slightly different requirements under those regulations. So thinking about how that applies to you and what these elements mean and the component parts that you're going to need to be comfortable with is really, really important for you as a medical device sort of entrepreneur and startup. Again, if we're looking at some of the other subtle differences between these set of regulations, to just draw your attention to clinical investigations. So at some point, depending upon the classification of your device, you're more than likely to have to conduct a clinical investigation to actually gather that sort of real world patient clinical evaluation and data to support how your medical device works. So here in the UK, we have guidances that support that activity, both for the manufacturers and also for investigators. And the reason being that we have the guidance documents is essentially our medical device regulation is really made up from the European Medical Device Directive. So we have the General Medical Device Directive, we also have the In Vitro Diagnostic Directive, and we also have the active implantables, so the AIMDD medical device directives. So our regulations have been made up around that. We are going through a consultation process, or have just come out of a consultation process. We're definitely going to see some changes in our regulations here in the UK. I think we're going to align ourselves much more towards the, I suppose, more stringent requirements of the European MDR. So we'll see those changes coming through over the next year or so. Here in Europe, again, you'll see that the elements that are pertaining to clinical investigations are much more thorough and stringent, specifically around Article 62 all the way through to Article 82 of the device regulation. So there's a huge amount of compliance that's going to be needed from yourselves when you get to that stage. Obviously, depending upon the route that you take from the US side of things, that will be whether you go through a 510K clearance. For those, clinical data is not always required. Occasionally, you can actually just use existing literature to support your applications. But certainly when you start to think about the higher classes of medical devices and you're looking at that pre-market authorization route, absolutely that will require full clinical investigation, and probably your de novo route is more than likely going to require you to conduct some form of clinical investigation. So you can see the subtle differences, but it's really important to think about what that means for you. So some of our clients who want to work maybe say in the UK and in Europe, we would probably encourage them to really comply with the European MDR, because obviously meeting those standards, you're inadvertently going to meet the standards of the UK MDR at this stage where we're sitting in terms of our regulations. So it's really thinking about how much work you're going to need to do both in your preclinical and into your clinical spaces to move your device through the conformity assessment route. One key thing that I need to mention is about safety and performance requirements. So again, all manufacturers of a medical device have to demonstrate that they have met safety and performance requirements of their device. There are definitely subtle differences between what we require here in the UK, what's required in Europe, and certainly what's required in the US. So because we are essentially, our regulations are made up of medical device directives, here in the UK, we ask you to comply with essential requirements, and you can find that in Annex 1 of our medical device regulations. These are all elements that pertain to the development of your device. So right the way through from sort of prototypes, going through all these sort of validations, the prototypes, the testing, whether you are interacting with energy sources, whether there are special circumstances involved in how your device performs, you will have to demonstrate to the authorities and equally to your authorised or notified bodies when you go through the conformity assessment routes that you have met each and every single one of those essential requirements. In Europe, we refer to them as general safety and performance requirements. Again, I would say they are definitely more evolved than just the essential requirements under the UK MDR. So I would always encourage any of you, even if you want to just work in the UK, to really think about the European MDR general safety and performance requirements. There is a really big checklist that you will need to complete and file as part of any of your authority applications. So it's really becoming familiar with what that looks like as you evolve your product. In the US, they don't really refer to it as general safety and performance requirements, so there isn't a single term really, but essentially they're asking you to provide reasonable assurance that your product is safe and it's going to be effective, and that's also dictated by the route that you take in the US. So you absolutely cannot sell any of your products in any of the markets unless you have demonstrated as a manufacturer that you have met all of those requirements. When I say it's a general checklist, actually there's a huge amount of work involved. All of this technical documentation that you're going to be gathering, when you are being able to demonstrate how you are complying with each of those requirements, feeds into your quality management system and the technical documentation that's going to be reviewed by the authorities. So that leads me nicely on to communication. It's a huge part of what you guys are going to be involved in. So here we can see you have your synapses. It's your single point of contact. It's your single point of exchange. And you can absolutely sort of relay this to how you're going to interact with your authorities and your notified or approved bodies. There is no getting away from having to deal with the authorities, unfortunately. It's probably one of the most challenging and complex elements of your sort of bringing your device to commercialization, but doing it in the right way, presenting the right information, asking the right questions at the right time is critical to the success that you will see through your commercialization journey. So some of the sort of areas that you may engage may actually only be through providing some form of technical documentation, a self-declaration form, certainly for your class 1 elements. So as a manufacturer, you can self-declare both in the UK and in Europe, depending upon what your device is doing. Obviously, if you have a class 1 medical device that has a measuring function or a sterility function, you may also still have to bring in an approved body and go through some form of conformity assessment. But certainly for the low risk, low class products, you might not actually necessarily have to physically engage with the authorities. I mean, you can just self-declare. Certainly for the US, you will be absolutely engaging with the FDA during those process. So I can't emphasize enough, going back to the question that we sort of posed at the beginning, is when to interact and when to engage early. I would say here in the UK, we definitely have a very pragmatic authority. So the Medicines and Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency, so the MHRA, has a really pragmatic device side of it. We engage quite freely and quite openly with them. They want you to be successful. They want you to bring your innovations to market. They're not there to sort of catch you out. So they will try to support you to make sure that you are being as compliant as you can be throughout the process. So really engage early in the process with your regulators and your approved or notified bodies. What can some of those challenges be, or what do they look like for you? I would say, certainly from my perspective and in the interactions that we have with our clients, misclassification of the device can be quite complex. So as I've shown you in the last couple of slides, you can see the differences between some of those regulations. And actually, it's quite easy to misclassify your device. We've had situations where we've had clients who have a device here in the UK, but it looks slightly different in Europe and looks completely different in the US. We had one client whereby it was classed as a medical device here in Europe and the UK. It was a pharmaceutical in the US. So don't always assume that actually once you've set the classification of your device, it's going to be the same across each of the regulators and the markets and territories that you're going to be working in. More often than not it is, but don't make that assumption. So really thinking about the classification and what that looks like, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Equally, if you have a poorly structured quality management system, it's really the sort of area that holds you up as a manufacturer, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. But not having the right information within your quality management system, not conforming to ISO 13485, not understanding the nuances in which your device works or what you're intending to do means that you may be deficient not only in technical documentation, but it may also mean that you're deficient in clinical data as well. So it's really easy. We heard some of our startups on Friday talking about preparing their prototypes in their garage. Well, that's great in that sort of pre-clinical setting, but once you start to translate that into a clinical setting, it's really important that you are thinking about what that clinical data looks like, how you're going to gather that clinical data, and how that feeds into clinical evaluation, and then equally how that is going to be reviewed by the authorities and also by your approved and notified bodies. So in summary, just for this sort of section that we've spoken about, it really is thinking about the end before you can really start at the beginning, determining which markets you want to be in, which set of regulations are going to apply to you. Do you need to have representatives that are going to be your sort of authorized lead in those territories? So certainly here, if you're a UK manufacturer, to be able to sell your product in Europe, you're going to need to have a European representative. Vice versa, if you are a European manufacturer, you're certainly going to need to have a UK representative to do the same thing, and it's no different to the US. So it's really thinking about who those stakeholders are and how they're going to, support you in this process. Really then preparing all the necessary documentation. So you are going to need to prepare separate files for each of those territories when you start to apply to the authorities through that conformity assessment route. So making sure that you've got the right information at the right time for the right territories that you're working within. And then also, if you are going to have to appoint a notified or approved body to take you through that conformity assessment route, then it's making sure that you are choosing the right one for your product. So making sure that they have experience with the device that you are intending to use, making sure that they have experience of the therapeutic areas that you're going to be working in, so that they can do a full and thorough conformity assessment review. Making sure that they can work in the particular territory that you are looking to eventually commercialize your product within. So there are some approved bodies that only work in the UK, which means that they can only issue the UK CA mark. There are some bodies that only work in Europe, so they can only issue the European CE mark. There are obviously those that work across those territories that can issue both of those. So again, thinking about how you're going to interact. As a manufacturer, it's your responsibility for your device. It will be your responsibility to engage your approved or notified bodies. It's not in Europe and the UK, it is not the authorities that will take you through the conformity assessment route. It will be your approved or notified bodies. So essentially, you will engage with them, you will contract with them. You actually have to pay them quite a lot of money to do this for you on your behalf. But it's making sure that they really do understand your product and what you're trying to achieve as a manufacturer. So absolutely, engage early, ask the right questions, and make sure that you've got the right people around you to take you forward. And obviously for the US, you won't be appointing authorized or notified bodies, but you'll be dealing directly with the FDA, depending upon which route you go down. So that's just in summary of the elements that we've covered. So taking us through to our quality management system. And as I alluded to before, the quality management system really here is your backbone. It's the structural element that's going to really hold you up as a manufacturer. It's where you are going to keep and collate and compile all of your technical documentation. It's what you are going to present that's going to be held up and be scrutinized by the authorities and either the approved or the notified bodies. So it's really, really important that you are familiar with the requirements of the quality management system and what you're going to need to have in place as a manufacturer. As we've talked about before, the quality management system that we often refer to is aligned to the ISO standards, so 13485. So really becoming familiar with what that looks like as a whole. You absolutely have to have a quality management system in place. You are certainly not going to get through a conformity assessment route. You're certainly not going to be able to commercialise and sell your product without having a compliant quality management system in place. So again, making sure that you have individuals within your organisation that have experience of putting this together. We have dealt with some manufacturers that thought it was quite a good idea to sort of pull their own quality management system together, and they certainly then didn't get through the conformity assessment route and almost had to go right back to basics and appoint the right people. So you can definitely save yourself time and money by choosing the right people at the right time. At certain stages, you don't necessarily always have to have a full quality management system, certainly as you're going through those sort of prototypes and those stages, but you'll be developing your quality management system as your device evolves. And as I mentioned before, the FDA is definitely planning to harmonise its own sort of Code of Federal Regulations against the ISO standards. So we should see that coming into effect next year. Please make sure that you have enough money in place to support some of these elements. Certainly in the summer school day that we had, Daniel Green very much took us through what it looks like for entrepreneurs and startups and sort of the funding that's going to be required for your product. You know, average costs, to just give you some indication for a quality management system, you're looking at around about $20,000, and that's really going to sort of take you through the certification and the audits. But then you've obviously got the costs for maintaining that quality management system and your sort of post-marketing element. So it's certainly not a sort of cheap endeavour to do that. This is on top of all your manufacturing costs, potentially looking at conducting clinical investigations, appointing the right people around you. So you absolutely have to make sure that you have the right funding in place to support yourselves moving forward. So when you're looking at the key elements, and I've picked the 5 key elements of a quality management system, you're really looking at those areas around how you are establishing your device. So looking at everything from the business as a whole and the organisation and how you pull that together, looking at the people that you have, your leadership structure, the training that needs to be put in place, all of that, in the interactions, the escalations, the risk management areas, all of that's going to sort of feed into your quality management system. Again, looking at the communication that you will have with your regulatory bodies, looking at your quality policies, the objectives, the resources that you're going to need to have in place. All of this is defined within your quality management system. Looking at your planning and the execution of product development, so how you're going to sort of bring your device to fruition, really, and take that through the conformity assessment route. And that really will also sort of dictate what you'll need to do in terms of verification, validation, traceability of your device, the specific component parts that may be required, as I say, if you're interacting with energy sources or you've got a particularly high risk product. So what does that really look like for you? And then thinking about the sort of monitoring and the measuring processes that you're going to need to have in place for your product, how you're going to analyze that data, how you're going to drive continuous improvement. So it's not just a sort of stop one sort of shot in the sand, as it were, and then that's your quality management system completed. It's very much an iterative, continual process of development. So as a manufacturer, you will have to have all of these elements in place to ensure that you are going to have a quality management system that complies with the applicable regulations that relate to your device. The other area that you absolutely need to be aware of, and we touched upon this earlier, is about device classification. So as a manufacturer, it's your responsibility to ensure that you have classified your device correctly. And this really comes down to how you propose or intend to use your device. So what's the intended purpose? So if we are taking the sort of brain function as an analogy, we can very much align this to the basal ganglia. This is your gatekeeper for movement, helping select and initiate those desired actions. So this is really around you selecting your device category. It's based on risk, it's based on function, it's based on intended use. So the things that you will have to start thinking about before you can start to classify your product is looking at the duration of use. So are you intending your device to just be transient use or short-term use, or is it going to be a longer-term use? Is it going to be implantable? What does the invasiveness look like? Is there an active function there? So is it linked to an energy source? What's the anatomical impact? So you need to start thinking about all of these elements so that it will enable you to identify the right classification for your medical device. In the UK and Europe, as a manufacturer, it's absolutely your responsibility to classify the device. In the US, it's actually the FDA that classifies the device, but you still need to be familiar with how what process you need to go through in order to classify that, and then what that means really in terms of the subsequent conformity assessment reads. And clearly your device has to meet the UK, the European or the US regulatory requirements if it's going to be sold in those respective markets. So this just gives you an example of what that classification looks like. So here in the UK, you can see the UK MDR versus the European MDR. So the classification is very much around sets of rules, and those rules determine how your product is being used. And from those rules, you can then work out the classification. So for instance, to just give you an example, if you were looking at an implantable device, the rules that apply to that are rules 8 under the regulations, both in the UK and under the EU MDR. So you can go to rule 8 within the regulations and you can work through that rule, and it will then determine what the classification of your device looks like. If you have a non-invasive device, you will go to rule 1 to 4 under the regulations and work through those rules, and it will then determine the classification at the end of that. So to give you an example, in a moment, well, actually, I'll come to that in a moment. But clearly, one of the key messages, I suppose, is don't misclassify. As we said right at the very beginning, it's really easy to do that. You see all of these rules here. There are lots of different rules. You've got rules 1 to 4 that apply just to non-invasive devices. So if you don't really understand how your product is working, it's really difficult to determine which rule actually applies to you. So it can be easy to misclassify. And we definitely see that time and time again with our clients that come and are working with us. They will often, classify their device as a class 2A when in fact, actually, it's a class 3. So we will work with our clients to sort of demystify in some respects what those rules look like. So this just gives you an example of how those rules work. So if we're taking an invasive device, for instance, so these are devices that are going to be invasive to a body orifice or even a stoma, but it's not surgically invasive. So again, it goes back to understanding how you intend your device to be used. So if you're intending your device to be invasive in that body orifice, but not surgically invasive, then you will come to Rule 5 under the set of regulations. You will see the little note here that says, attention, take note also of Rule 4 and 20 and 21, because there are other rules that may also apply to your invasive device. So you need to look at those and either rule them out or rule them in as a potential rule that may apply to your device. But if we're just taking a sort of general invasive device, you'll start with Rule 5, and then you ask yourself questions. You know, is it going to be, am I just going to use this, its transient use? Or is it going to be just short-term use? Or is it going to, or do I intend for it to be used in longer term? So if I intend for it to be used longer term, you can see quite clearly here, it's categorizing or classifying my device as a class 2B. But if I'm only intending my device to be used in the oral cavity or in the ear canal or in the nasal cavity, then actually that's going to be a class 2A. So it's being really familiar with how these rules work and how they apply to your device. So to just give you some examples, if you're looking at a vaginal speculum, for instance, that will be a class 1. These are products that actually you can self-declare, as we mentioned before. You don't have to necessarily go through the conformity assessment route. But then you've got things like contact lenses, or you might have NG feeding tubes that can be class 2A, or it could be a class 2A, 2B, depending upon your intended use. So being really familiar with the rules under the regulations is critically important to you actually not being in a situation where you have misclassified your device. But once you classified your device, that really sets your conformity assessment route. So as we said before, class 1s don't necessarily need to go down that route unless they've got a measuring or a sterile function, but certainly your class 2s, 2As, 2Bs, or your class 3s will invariably involve a conformity assessment route. So that moves us nicely on to what does that conformity assessment route look like for you as a manufacturer? And I think our cerebellum here coordinates all of this for us. It coordinates our movements. It ensures that we're in balance. And this is no different to making sure that we can bring our devices to market safely and in balance with those regulatory requirements. So you as the manufacturer remain legally responsible for the device. So it's really important that you work very closely with your notified or approved bodies or the FDA directly to be able to demonstrate conformity. As we mentioned before, those bodies are independent organisations. They're designated and authorised by the regulators. But certainly it's not the regulators here in the UK and in Europe that will undertake that conformity assessment route. They will undertake that with you and also oversee you in terms of your ongoing surveillance. So they will provide you with your certification, whether that's here in the UK or in Europe, but they will certainly undertake further audits of you when you get into that post-marketing remit. So this is, I appreciate, is a busy slide, but again, it's really just to highlight to you what some of those conformity assessment routes look like. And in most instances, certainly when you get to the class 2A and the class 2Bs, invariably you're probably going to go down a full quality assurance review. That may or may not involve some form of production quality review, or some product quality assurance. So it really just depends on the type of device and then the type of conformity assessment route that you will undertake. It really depends on the duration of time that this will take, and so you will be working actively with your bodies to go through this route. So this is what it looks like in the UK. It's not distinctly dissimilar in Europe. It's just that the component parts of the regulations and the annexes that dictate the routes are slightly different. So it's just being aware of where you need to look depending upon the market that you're going to be working or the territory that you're going to be undertaking your conformity assessment route with. Before you can fully go through the conformity assessment route, I'll take you right back to one of the slides that I showed where, as a manufacturer, you have to demonstrate that you can comply with all the essential requirements or the safety and performance requirements of your medical device. And part of those requirements is for you as a manufacturer to be able to demonstrate the clinical evaluation that you've undertaken so that you can provide assurances to the authorities, but ultimately to your patients and end users, that your product is safe to use and it performs in the way in which you intend it to perform. And so you have to be able to provide clinical data to support that. So here we have our hippocampus, we have our memory center. And this really, as a manufacturer, relates to how you are collecting, organizing, and validating what you already know, but also, and proving what you already know, but also thinking about what is it that you don't know. And if there are gaps in those requirements, you may need to fill that with doing some form of clinical investigation. So this is what your clinical evaluation looks like. And again, I only want to really draw your attention to the areas that I've highlighted in red for you. So you can see the sort of subtle differences between the UK, Europe and the US. So here in the UK, you may be able to use published literature, but you certainly will have to provide some clinical experience and investigation. It's exactly the same in Europe. The US is slightly different. You may be able to draw upon clinical evidence or sort of predicate devices that are already on the market. But if you also look at the line that says, you know, when do you need to do a clinical investigation? Here in the UK, we say that you have to undertake clinical investigations when that evidence is insufficient. Again, it's exactly the same in Europe. In the US, a little bit different in that if you go through the pre-marketing route or pre-market authorization, yes, you're always going to have to do that because they're for the higher class products. It's not always needed under the 510K route, more often needed under the de novo route, especially when there isn't a predicate device on the market. So again, you can clearly see that the regulations are really dictating what you may need to have in place as a manufacturer in terms of presenting the information around clinical evaluation to the authorities and the gaps that you may have to fill in terms of clinical investigation. So if we look at your clinical investigation, so what's the analogy that we have here? So this is your motor cortex. This is initiating and controlling those voluntary movements. And this is no different to you having to translate your clinical investigation plan into action. So actually bringing your clinical investigation to life in the form of a clinical trial. So this is the side-by-side comparison of what this looks like under the regulations. And so again, the specific regulations and the articles will apply under the EU MDR. The Code of Federal Regulations will apply there. Here we have the MHRA that oversees clinical investigations. Obviously in Europe, it's the applicable member states and the competent authorities in each of those member states. And obviously in the US, it's the FDA, so it's the Centre for Devices and Radiological Health, so CDER. The typical submission contents, are fairly similar between the different authorities. You'll need your application forms. You'll absolutely need to have an investigator's brochure in place, because you've got an investigative device. So your investigator's brochure will have lots of your preclinical elements in. You'll need to have your clinical investigation plan, so your SIP in place. So essentially your trial protocol. You will certainly have to have all your quality management system details identified. Your risk analysis will need to be in there, and essentially your essential requirements or your safety and performance checklists will need to be in there as well. Here in the UK, we have a combined route that we go that we apply to, that is combined both for our regulators and our ethics committees. The timelines for the MHRA here are 60 days to approve a clinical investigation. In Europe, it's a little bit longer, but it does vary from member state to member state, depending upon the type of device that you are working with. Just to note that at some point there will be a central system very similar to the UK for medical device clinical investigation submissions, but right now UDMED isn't up and running and fully functional, so you still have to make individual submissions to each of the member states. So it is a little bit more protracted at the moment, but you are moving towards a centralized system. And obviously depending upon the FDA route will dictate the timelines in the US, but obviously then you will still need to have your IRB approval in place there. You also then need to think about the safety reporting requirements for that particular clinical investigation. So here in the UK, we have to submit all serious adverse events, all device deficiencies. We also have to submit protocol deviations and quarterly safety reports and final reports. So there's quite a lot of involvement there in terms of interactions with the authorities. It's very similar process in Europe as well for that, and probably not distinctly different in the US. It's just the routes and the mechanism for those reports are just slightly different. Clearly, the higher the device, the higher the risk, the more mitigations you're going to have to put in place to be able to demonstrate to the authorities that the intended clinical investigation is still going to be safe, but it's also going to provide the sort of data gap really in terms of your clinical investigation. So you need to be really thorough and clear with the objectives of your clinical investigations to fill that safety and performance gap there. So in summary, just as the healthy brain function depends on interconnected adaptive pathways and your regulatory success really does depend on recognizing your systems and not resisting it. You absolutely are not going to get away with having to conform with regulations. So the more you plan, the more you understand, the more comfortable you are in that setting, actually the greater success you're going to achieve going through your conformity and commercialization route. So absolutely make sure that you embed your regulatory planning from day one. Make sure that you build a QMS that is an evolving QMS, and it's not that it just complies with the element that you're working on that particular day. It's an evolving process. Make sure that you walk with experts. As I said at the beginning, this isn't a sort of solo rodeo. This is absolutely going to pull upon multiple stakeholders in the process. It's going to pull upon experts that are going to help you with your manufacturing steps. It's going to pull on experts that are going to be able to pull your QMS together. It's going to pull on experts that can take you through those regulatory hurdles help you to develop your clinical investigations or your clinical investigation evaluation plans, making sure that you interact with the notified or approved bodies in the right way. So you are absolutely going to need to potentially involve CROs at some point and other consultants. Recognise as a manufacturer, but also as a startup and an entrepreneur, because you're going to wear many hats, where your skill set ends and somebody else's skill set needs to take over. And keep your innovation moving forward. We need you guys to be progressing new devices onto the market and really helping us achieve those unmet clinical needs and bring those devices to patients in the quickest and the safest way possible. So I would say I take you back to the question that I sort of posed right at the very beginning. You know, when is the right time really to start interacting with the regulators? And the right time really is right at the very beginning, to really engage with them early and set your regulatory pathway. So I just finished with that final question. So what are your next moves? And thank you very much for listening.